Just a few weeks ago, on December 8th, Bashar al-Assad, the brutal leader of Syria, fell. Assad was responsible or is responsible for the death of over 500,000 of his own people since the civil war broke out there in 2011. He had been in power since the year 2000, but he succeeded his father, who was in power for 29 years. Assad was toppled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, a terrorist group affiliated with Al-Qaeda and backed by Turkey and, it seems, Qatar. In recent days, we've heard statements from HTS saying that they don't want to have war with their neighbors or the West, and urging Israel to now stop their operations in Syria. The truth is, it's hard to believe them. Now, what are they talking about when they ask Israel to step back? During the brief transition, Israel went in and wiped out much of Syria's military capabilities, with the Israeli Air Force striking their most strategic weapons: fighter jets, helicopters, Scud missiles, UAVs, cruise missiles, surface to sea and surface to air, precision missiles, radars, rockets, and more. We've also heard reports of Israel destroying Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles, which would be a blessing not just for Israel and for the West, but for the people of Syria themselves. Israel also took control of the Syrian side of the Hermon Mountains, an incredibly strategic point which is critical to Israel's national security. But what does the Assad's regime's fall mean? What does it mean for the Middle East? What does it mean for America? If you think about it, Syria's biggest patrons were Iran and Russia, who poured millions, if not billions of dollars to prop up the area. What does it mean to Qatar and Turkey, the patrons of this new government? One thing is for sure, the media is not answering these questions. Why? Maybe because it's a little complicated. It's not black and white. And maybe because it doesn't fit into their way of looking at the world. The truth is, no one knows where it's going. But it's a critical moment in history and in geopolitics in the region and, frankly, in the world. Which is not just interesting as an observer, but important for all of us to know as the United States and the West develops policies for this new Syria. From my perspective, we need to zoom out a little bit. Iran's attempt to end Israel on October 7th through the actions of Hamas and later Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran themselves has utterly failed. It's flipped the script. We are now seeing that Iran is in its last days, on its last legs. We're seeing a decimated Hamas, a decimated Hezbollah. The Houthis are still attacking, but we'll see where that goes. The future of the Middle East, from my perspective, is bright. Saudi Arabia is back at the table, no longer demanding a path for a Palestinian state in their normalization talks with Israel. We have very optimistic, but cautiously optimistic, of a hostage deal that's being discussed between Israel and Hamas that seems to be moving forward at this point. And we're seeing quiet in the region come, because in this region, strength wins. And that's what Israel has shown in the region in the past year. But to help make sense of all of this, I've invited Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, the Executive Director of the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, to the podcast. If you follow these topics closely, you know Dr. Schanzer, you know Jonathan. His face and voice are on Fox News, on CNN, on everywhere in between, trying to make sense of the chaos that's there. But when I see him talking on these networks, I want to scream at the television because they give him 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes to talk, maximum. And these issues are much more complicated than 1.5 minutes and 2, but that's why we have podcasts. We're lucky enough that he joins us today. Jonathan previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of Treasury, where he followed and froze the funding of Hamas and Al-Qaeda. He previously held think tank research positions at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum. He's written hundreds of articles on the Middle East and U.S. national security. We will discuss what happened with Assad, who toppled him, who this group is, what they're saying, what should be believed, how the United States and the West should deal with them, how Israel should deal with this new Syria, what it means for Iran, what it means for Russia, and what it means for Turkey and Qatar, the new patrons of this new government. This is Standpoint. I'm Gabe Groisman, Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, pleasure, Gabe. Good to be with you.
Jonathan, let's jump right in. I mean, everybody sees what's happening in Syria. Nobody seems to understand it, but everybody really, if you have any idea of the Middle East and its impact on the rest of the world, you know that it's an important episode, an important chapter in the history of the Middle East that's going to impact the future. 53 years of Assad regimes, 29 years for his father Hafez, and 24 years, give or take, 25 or so for Bashar. We just start with the basics. How did Assad ultimately fall?
Yeah, so I mean, it's complex and it's simple. I mean, I think the simple version is that there was a Syrian civil war that gutted the country. It began in 2011 during what we call the Arab Spring. A bunch of Syrian opposition groups began to challenge the Assad regime. The opposition began to galvanize around two very troubling players after a time, one being the Nusra Front, or an Al-Qaeda group now known as HTS, and I'm sure we'll get to that momentarily. And the other, of course, being ISIS. At one point, they were working together. Then they stopped working together. They were largely defeated by the Iranians, the Russians, Hezbollah, and Assad. This was how Assad defended himself. He enlisted the assistance of the Iranians and the Russians and Hezbollah, ultimately prevailed somewhere around 2016, 2017. We really began to see the civil war in Syria trail off. Now, that led, by the way, that civil war led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. I mean, Assad slaughtered his own people. He used chemical weapons against his own people, displaced millions of people internally and externally. I mean, this was truly a genocide carried out by the country's leader. And of course, we don't hear about that from the human rights organizations that are monitoring these things. Only Israel gets singled out for those sorts of atrocities. But what happened is that the Syrian state really got hollowed out by all of this. And then the Russians, which had been there and been helping Assad, they got drawn into their war in Ukraine. The Iranians, began to get spread thin too as they fought Israel on 7 fronts over the last 14 months. At some point, as the Assad regime really began to look weak and battered in this war against Israel, I think the Nusra Front, now known as HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, with the help of the Turkish regime, and I think probably also money from the Qataris, they launched a lightning offensive. They moved from the north of the country to the south. They started in Aleppo and they ended up in Damascus. In 11 days, they conquered the entire country of Syria. And right now, when we look out, people are saying, hey, it's good. Assad was an ally of Iran. He was one of the bad guys. No question he was. But I think we need to acknowledge the fact right now that Al-Qaeda is in control of Syria.
Yeah, that's something that's really kept, first of all, it's kept the media almost quiet about it, especially we'll get to Israel's response. Well, I guess if I mentioned it, I'll explain it. Israel took an opportunity to attack the military capabilities of Syria once the Syrian army left their bases, hitting the Navy, the Air Force, hitting supposedly their chemical weapons stockpiles. That hasn't been confirmed yet as far as I've seen. The world media hasn't really blinked. And I think really the reason why is, one, they know taking away weapons from bad guys isn't a bad thing, but also because it doesn't really fit into the rubric of the way that they were looking at the world. If Israel, the bad guys, how can they be doing something good there? And they're really not sure who to get behind in Syria. But, it's really complex in the sense that it seems, and tell me if I'm wrong, that we're replacing Iran and Russia, who are the two powers that were supporting and holding up Syria and Assad. We're replacing them with Turkey and Qatar. Is that right?
No, that's right. And I think, there are going to be people, when you say that, they're going to say, oh, well, that's not so bad because, Turkey is a NATO ally and Qatar is a major non-NATO ally here in the United States. And so these are people that we can work with. They're pragmatists. They're allies of the U.S. Except when you start to scratch the surface just a little bit, you begin to realize how problematic that is. I mean, first, let's just acknowledge Al-Qaeda in any form running a country, supremely bad idea, right? And we've seen what Islamist states look like when they're run by extremists like this, whether it's the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has been a complete disaster for the Iranian people and for the world. The Taliban in Afghanistan is another example of just a disastrous rule by Islamists. And even Sudan, right? It's another country that in 1989 was taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood. You can take a look at the support that they've been giving Al-Qaeda, Iran, the genocide in Darfur. I mean, this is never a good thing. But when you scratch the surface and you look at the patrons of the new regime in Syria, that's where I really start to have, you can see me start to get nervous here. So first, Turkey. Turkey is a sponsor of Hamas. Turkey actually helped facilitate the movement of ISIS fighters into Iraq and Syria at the height of that battle. They sold ISIS oil. They sold antiquities that were being stolen from Syria and Iraq. They really helped ISIS survive during the height of that battle. The Turks have also been responsible for a massive money laundering scheme. They helped Iran launder $20 billion at the height of our effort to try to put sanctions on that regime for its illicit nuclear program. So when you start to take a look at what Turkey's been up to, it's been absolutely, I mean, it qualifies as a state sponsor of terrorism, and yet they're in NATO. U.S. hands are tied. We don't really have a way out of this, at least right now. There's no mechanism for throwing a country out of NATO. But the Turks are highly problematic, not interested at all in stability. And I think, if anything right now, I would just say all the talk about, a pragmatic state in Syria being promised by, the new leaders or by the Turks, we should take with a grain of salt. But the other patron here is Qatar. And they're very similar to the Turks in the sense that, they're viewed as allies of the United States, but they too are major sponsors of Hamas. They've been giving Hamas $30 million a month leading up to the war that was launched on October 7th. But, when you go to Qatar, and I'm not allowed to go back anytime soon, but over the years, I've seen, not just Hamas guys that are based there, but Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Muslim Brotherhood. These people are not our friends. It's got to be clear at some point that these are Islamists that are playing in the West and pretending that they're sort of part of our system, when in fact they're sponsors of a range of actors that are enemies of the United States and enemies of the West. And so these are the new patrons right now of the new Al-Qaeda regime in Syria. Whatever they're doing now, whatever they're saying now, this sort of, the nod to pragmatism or moderation, I got to say, the overwhelming likelihood here is that this is a short-term tactic. That long-term, Al-Qaeda, we've got a pretty good sense of what they want to do, what their aims are. And I'm pretty sure they've got their eyes on Jerusalem right now, but maybe other pro-American, Western-leaning regimes in the region, including, and I'm very worried about Jordan and its stability right now because they're on the border with this new Al-Qaeda regime in Syria.
Yeah, and it's even worse than that, I think, for Qatar, in the sense that they're not just viewed as an ally. When you speak to members of Congress about it on or off the record, they'll tell you how important of a role that they play, because they've been meeting with rebels and opposition groups there in Doha for so many years. And it's like, so what, right? And we have 12,000 American troops there. We can move them in a minute, and we shouldn't be making allyships with countries that play on both sides of the fence, and which is, for me, the most concerning part, because we see the Middle East changing so much now post October 7th. We'll get to that at the end of the pod. It's when I see Qatar and Turkey, I see Turkey teaching Qatar how to play both sides of the fence, to be both a NATO ally and a sponsor of terror at the same time, and play both sides to that, which is to their benefit, which is, I think, a dangerous look for the Middle East.
It is, but I mean, I got to say, I think the Qataris have been arsonist and firefighter probably longer than the Turks have. I mean, they both do it pretty well. They are very. I mean, I call them both frenemies of the United States, right? They're friends that act like enemies, and I think we need to acknowledge that this is really a horrible model for the U.S. alliance structure. That when we allow our allies to act like this, what it does is it sends terrible messages to others in the region that they can play a similar double game with us. And so it's highly problematic, and they're both really good at it. They're both, by the way, the key sponsors, not just of Hamas in the Sunni world, because that we've seen very clearly over the course of this war, but they're the key sponsors of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that, I think, is also important as we head into a new Trump administration. Trump last time around was actually interested in designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization writ large. It's highly complex what he was considering and what he may be considering again. And I'll be very interested to watch it because the Muslim Brotherhood has lots of different member organizations across the entire Muslim world. The Brotherhood itself is a highly ideological, anti Western, dangerous organization that is the cornerstone of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban and every bad actor that we've watched emerge in the Middle East and pose threats to the West. But not every one of these member organizations, these individual chapters of the Muslim Brotherhood, will meet the criteria for designation. They're all radical, but they each engage in violence to different degrees. And so we're going to have to be really careful about how we move forward on that. But Turkey and Qatar are the key sponsors of this global movement. And that is, I think, not well understood in Washington or in Western capitals, where both countries are still seen as allies and partners, and they should not be.
Yeah, and I took a look at the DNI list before going on air with you, and HTS is already listed as a foreign terrorist group. So the way the U.S. deals with them is going to be incredibly interesting, and will have a huge impact. But we've been talking a lot about, we've zoomed in a little. I just want to zoom out a little bit on the impact that this has, the fall of Assad will have or is having on both Iran and Russia. Right, we've seen Iran's proxies taking huge hits. Maybe we've been celebrating a little too early. Last night, the Houthis shot some rockets at Israel. One hit a school. Luckily, it was at night and no one was in there, but did destroy the school. So it looks like they're still kicking. But this obviously has had a huge impact on Iran. And it's yet to be seen what impact it'll have on Russia. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the big story, I think, is that the Iranian land bridge, if you will, stretching from Iran through Iraq into Syria into Lebanon, it's been cut off. The Assad regime was a key fixture in what we call the Shiite Crescent, right? This was the ability of Iran to project power, to provide weapons and cash, and really to provide training even to Hezbollah. With Assad gone and with the Shia militias that were based there that were smuggling Captagon and bringing in huge amounts of money for not just the Assad regime, but for the broader Iranian axis, this is a debilitating blow. Hezbollah cannot rearm right now, and it is already reeling from the beating that it took from Israel over the last, let's say, 4 months. Israel really turned on the afterburners and really weakened Hezbollah considerably. This comes amidst the severe weakening. We're, I think, on the verge of watching a surrender by Hamas. So that's good news. The Israelis obviously were also able to take out the air defenses of Iran itself inside Iran. They took out ballistic missile production capabilities inside Iran. So when you look right now across the region, Iran's axis is severely weakened. Israel looks like it's potentially on the verge of a modest victory here after 14 months, almost 15 months of hard fighting. I would say that, you mentioned the Houthis, they're still kicking. They are. I think they're still going to be able to pose a threat to the region. And I would also keep an eye on the West Bank if you're looking for where the hot spots could be. Even after the hard fighting comes to a close, Iran can still pose a challenge to Israel, even if a number of those 7 fronts have been neutralized or even defeated. So that's on the Iran front. And then there's Russia. Russia, it's interesting. I mean, the Russians entered Syria primarily because the Obama administration refused to, if you remember, the Red Line debacle of 2013, right? Assad
Absolutely.
Assad uses chemical weapons on his own people. Obama says he's going to go in and restore order and take care of the problem. Ultimately declines to do it. And when he does, that's the moment that Vladimir Putin steps in and begins to exploit the vacuum that the US creates. So Putin has gone in. He shored up the regime for a time. Of course, after he got into that war in Ukraine, he began to redeploy assets out of Syria, thereby weakening the country. But the Russians still maintained garrisons and bases throughout the country. The big asset that they have is actually the warm water port of Tartus, which is right on the Mediterranean. This is their naval base where they've been delivering weapons and selling them to the Iranian axis in the Middle East and also selling other goods to the Syrians. that is very much in doubt, and so is the existence of some of their bases. It'll be really interesting to see whether the Russians are able to renegotiate an agreement with the new Sunni rulers, the new Al-Qaeda rulers of Syria, the Turkish-backed rulers of Syria. It's a tense moment. I think it's going to be fascinating to see whether the Russians can sustain a relationship. By the way, it's not unheard of that the Iranians also may be able to continue to work with this regime. I mean, the fact that it's been disrupted doesn't mean that it's permanently disrupted. Fortunately, Al-Qaeda and Iran do have a history of working together. It's an uneasy relationship, but it is one that we've seen. I mean, Iran had its fingerprints on the 9/11 plot. Iran was collaborating with some of the Sunni jihadis that were attacking American servicemen in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this would not be unheard of. I think overall, though, I think, the way that you pose the question is the right one. How weak are they? Both Iran and Russia seem to have taken it on the chin as a result of that really surprising collapse of the Assad regime.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was very clear. There's been a lot of ambiguity for some reason about who the quote rebel group or coalition group or the coalition forces. They use all these different words to describe HTS, who've taken over in Syria. But give us a little bit about who they are. Who are these new leaders of Syria? What are people missing?
So, I mean, look, first, HTS, or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as it's known, again, formerly known as the Nusra Front. A couple of years into the Syrian civil war, there was an effort made to try to rebrand the Nusra Front because they had been allies with ISIS, and that was a bad look for them. Globally, they were not going to get the respect or the recognition that perhaps they had hoped for. So they went through sort of a facelift of sorts, encouraged by the Turks, encouraged by the Qataris. So they change their name and they have a divorce with ISIS. So they start to put ISIS at arm's length. They call themselves Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And it's the Liberation Front of the Levant. So we'll just be very clear here. They have designs beyond Syria. When you talk about the Levant, you're talking about Jordan, you're talking about Israel and Syria, maybe even Iraq, if you want to take kind of a maximalist view. So I think this group has regional aspirations. We know that in the past, they have been involved in mass atrocities, really the wanton killing of minority groups in Syria, the brutality that Al-Qaeda was known for, beheadings and mass killings. Not a moderate group, but a lot of focus has been placed on Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, the head of this group of HTS. Back in the day, before the facelift, before the attempt to go on a charm offensive with the West, this was a guy that had kind of a long bushy beard and a turban, now goes around with a more trimmed beard look, wearing a hat, a baseball hat instead of a turban, wearing fatigues. I think the effort here is to convey him as a, more of a legitimate, pragmatic military man. His statements to Israel and to the West is that, they're looking inward. They want to sustain a modicum of stability in Syria. They're not interested in fighting with Israel or the West, even as Israel has targeted a lot of the platforms and weapons that formerly belonged to the Assad regime to make sure that they don't fall into the wrong hands. By the way, the U.S. has been targeting ISIS, I think, about a dozen times inside Syria. In other words, the Israelis and the U.S. are trying to kind of shape the environment and make sure that it doesn't get worse. Whether that'll work or not, I don't know. But Jawlani himself, not a moderate, not a guy that I think I'd want to place trust in right now. The other thing, by the way, that I think, the folks in Israel that are maybe a little less nervous about this, they're saying Iran was the real threat and the Sunni threat is maybe not as bad. Just look at the guy's nickname, all right? Abu Muhammad just means father of Muhammad. That's, nothing to worry about there. But then al-Jawlani, he's actually referring to his aspirations to take the Golan, right? This is like, let's just say this guy's not done with his mission. And so I think the U.S. and Israel need to keep a close eye. I'm not saying that Israel needs to go to war right now with the new Turkey-backed Al-Qaeda state in Syria, but I would say that there needs to be a high amount of vigilance here for what may emerge. Because again, if we look at Iran, Taliban, Sudan, Islamist regimes run by Al-Qaeda or other extremists don't work out well in the long run.
Yeah, for people who don't know, Israel, on the northeast corner of Israel, at the edge of the Golan or the Hermon Mountains, Israel has control of the Israeli Hermon, which is, we've always said has now created safety in in northern Israel and in the Golan. But looming on top of the Israeli Hermon or is the Syrian Hermon, which Israel has taken control over also, which is strategically critical. I just want to ask you a question. There was a post yesterday online, and we don't want to just trust things you see online. So I'm going to ask you what you think on this. And we have not spoken about this, but there's a page called Open Source Intel on Twitter has put out some pretty good information since the war started last year. Said there was an alleged deal between Assad and Israel. Middle Eastern media is buzzing with reports citing Turkey's Hurriyet newspaper that a reliable source revealed that Bashar al-Assad provided Israel with a detailed list of weapons depots, missile systems, and warplanes as a guarantee that Israel wouldn't target him as he exits Syria. Have you heard this at all, that Assad was sort of gave the coordinates, the targets to Israel as if they needed them, so that way they wouldn't go after him as he exited Syria? Have you heard anything on this?
Look, I saw that post. I don't know whether that's true or not. I do know that Assad and Israel had their contacts, whether it was through the UAE or through the United States. In the past, there were even moments where they almost made peace or almost normalized. I don't know whether the Assad regime was interested in giving the Israelis, handing them favors on his way out. I'm fairly certain the Israelis didn't need him to tell them where to find
that was my sense,
those dangerous platforms. But we do know that Assad was trying to cut deals in his last days to try to get help from the Israelis, to get help from the U.S. to keep him in power as he began to realize that the end was near. So, I'd be curious. Maybe he did that as a way to. Maybe he was handing out targets to the Israelis of places that were already conquered as a means to try to keep him in power in the Damascus corridor. Maybe, but I think we'll find out more in the days and weeks to come. The guy's still there. He's in Moscow right now. He can take to the airwaves. He can share things about what happened. Quite seen that yet. More information will come. There will be people who finally get to him for interviews and get him to go on the record. Now, whether he speaks the truth about everything, that's another story.
Yeah, so I think right before we recorded this, there was a Facebook post by a journalist, quote unquote journalist from Russia, saying that he spoke to him and kind of had no remorse on anything that happened, and saying he was going to help the troops in Russia. Kind of found his way out there, but we'll see more as that unveils. That was just before we started recording. But this morning, the BBC was super excited because Ahmed al-Sharaf from this group said that they are exhausted by war and they're not a threat to the West or their neighbors, and sanctions should be lifted. They're really trying to make themselves out to be the good guys. I saw your post yesterday, Jonathan, on Instagram, basically saying these guys are not to be believed. What do you think?
Look, they can't be believed. Look, I think that it's quite likely that the U.S. lifts the bounty. We have a $10 million bounty on Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, on the head of HTS, calling for the killing of a nominal head of state, interim head of state, whatever we want to call him. That would run counter to American policy. So it would make sense that we would lift the bounty on his head. I don't think that we should be lifting sanctions against HTS. I think it is still, I know it is still an Al-Qaeda group and its intentions should not be trusted. So we can, I think, navigate this in a way that's smart. So, we don't call for the killing of a leader. By the way, I think there are plenty of people who probably want to kill him in Syria.
For free.
We don't need to put a bounty on his head. I think, this guy's going to have his own challenges for a time, because people remember the atrocities that he carried out as head of Nusra Front, and people know that he's still Nusra Front, even if he calls himself something else. So, but in the meantime, I think we continue to watch this new regime. I think we need to see what they do as it relates to the Kurdish minorities, to the Alawites that were once running the country, whether we see retribution against that minority, disgusting as they were. Wanton killing is something that, we don't want to see. The Druze, another minority that we want to see protected. American servicemen who are based in Syria, we want to see them protected. The Israeli border needs to remain untouched, right? These are all things that we need to continue to watch. And, we're only a few days into this new regime. Let's not trust them. Let's hold them to their word and, watch over the course of months, maybe even more than a year, before we start to make any decisions about, repealing designations. Al-Qaeda groups are, again, not typically inclined to change their ideology or their tactics. And I would just say that what this guy says now may not hold. Don't think that if the jihadi tells you something, he's just telling you the truth. We know they will lie. We know that there's a strong desire to survive at a very delicate moment right now in this transition. I think that's what we need to bear in mind here as people rush to somehow declare that these guys are moderates or that, we're in better shape because he's in charge in Syria. There is no evidence to support that yet. It doesn't mean we have to have a full-blown war, but let's not rush to believe them. That's insane.
Yeah, so far, President-elect Trump, former President Trump, has taken that exact stance, saying, "Let's wait and see. Let's not make any decisions yet. Let's wait and see how this falls out," which seems to be the smart play. I just wanted to note for our listeners that the Druze, Druze, who live mostly in northern Israel and in southern Syria, they're Arabs, they're not Jews, and they're not Muslims. There were Druze villages on the Syrian side who have publicly declared that they want to be annexed into Israel. They'd rather live in Israel than in Syria, which is, I think, throws a blowtorch or whatever expression we want to use towards all the people yelling that Israel's an apartheid regime when these Druze Arabs are asking to be a part of Israel instead of Syria. But I really just want to end with I think, the most important question as Americans when we're looking at what's happening in Syria. There's been a lot of discussions on the right of making sure that the U.S.'s work outside of its borders. So everything we're doing, whether it's militarily or financial assistance, et cetera, actually has a positive impact on U.S.'s national security interests. I've made the case many times as how a safe and secure Israel, it's not just a religious and historical imperative for the United States, but it's also critical for the U.S.'s national security interests. How does the change in Syria from Assad to this new group impact the U.S.'s national security interests? We know a lot is still up in the air, but what should we as Americans be looking out for?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. Look, I think it's a good thing that the Assad regime fell. This was considered an enemy state by all accounts by the US, and the Iranian land bridge that we discussed, it's been disrupted. I don't know about permanently, but it's been disrupted. And I think that's a very positive thing. It's going to stop the flow of drugs that are being sold by the regime. It's going to stop the flow of weapons that were being smuggled by the Iranian regime to other parts of the Middle East. I think it's a major disruption. So it's a positive in that sense. The problem is that we're dealing with Al-Qaeda at the end of the day, and we're dealing with patrons of this Al-Qaeda regime that we shouldn't be trusting. And so we're going to need to have a very strict policy. It needs to be conveyed to the Turks and the Qataris that our allies don't get touched. So that means Israel, it means the Kurds, it means the Druze. Nobody gets touched. This regime needs to be held to account. We need to watch for terror finance. We need to watch for possible collaboration with other Al-Qaeda groups, watch for possible collaboration with the Iranians. There's a lot that can still go very wrong. And so this incoming administration, I mean, look, I think the first thing is actually the outgoing administration better not recognize HTS as the legitimate rulers of Syria, and they should not remove the sanctions. I think that's sort of the first order of business. First, do no harm, right? Keep the current regime in place and make sure that they're being held to account. After that, I think Trump needs to reinforce the warning. Don't mess with our friends. Don't mess with our interests. And we need to try to get that hostage deal done in Gaza, try to bring the broader war to an end that's been raging across the Middle East for the last 14 months, and then begin to deal with the region country by country, making sure that our interests are secure. A lot of work to do in this new administration. They are inheriting really a chaotic Middle East right now. I think there is an attempt right now to say, hey, things are better because of Assad. I think we need to be careful. Yes, he fell. That's great. We have a positive development, but this is the Middle East. It's not the Midwest, man. This is a crazy part of the world, and a lot of things can go wrong, and they often do in this part of the world. So we need to manage this conflict. Doesn't mean we need to put boots on the ground. It doesn't mean we need to double down on our presence in the Middle East. It just means that we need to make our intentions very clear about what is happening there, that the broader war that Iran has been fighting needs to end, that we're going to help the Israelis continue to counter the threats that they face in the region, and that may include the new government in Syria.
Yeah, and from my perspective, just to share, Jonathan, is in the Middle East, people always talk about peace in the Middle East. And I talk about quiet in the Middle East. And I think that October 7th, which was meant to be, from Hamas's perspective, the match that lights Israel on fire and ends up throwing Israel into the sea, and Iran finally making its full push down, all the way down to Tel Aviv, with Hezbollah and Hamas collapsing on Israel, all failed. And it failed and flipped to the other side. And now I'm an optimist. So for me, I'm seeing the Hamas decimated, Hezbollah basically decimated, Assad gone, Iran on its last legs, and Saudi Arabia, which we hadn't spoken about, hopefully normalizing with Israel. They already took the nonsense of requiring a path towards a Palestinian state off the table, which we know the U.S. was really pushing them to ask for. So the Middle East is, I hope, we're going to see an era of quiet. And obviously, the only way there could be quiet in the Middle East is through strength. And I think that's what we need to see from the U.S. government in the region, and obviously our allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia and everyone else. But anyways, Jonathan Schanzer, thank you so much, Executive Director of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thanks for helping us make sense of the chaos in Syria. It's such a critical moment in history for America, for the Middle East, for the world. And thanks for helping clarify some of these things.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. Thanks for having me. Keep up the good work.
Thanks so much, everyone. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and do all the great things you do to support podcasts like this one. And we'll see you next time.